Hi, I'm Colleen Dulle, host of America Media's Inside the Vatican podcast. You're about to hear an in-depth conversation on Pope Francis' comments on the question of denying communion to politicians in the United States. I'll be joined by Father Sam Sawyer, a senior editor at America Media, who has written extensively on this issue and has a lot of great insights to share with us. Before we begin, please make sure that you hit that red subscribe button on your screen. And if these are the kinds of conversations that you value, you can support our ministry and access all of our digital content by purchasing a subscription to America Magazine. You can do that at americamagazine.org/subscribe, and you can find that link in the description below. Yesterday, Pope Francis returned from his papal visit to Hungary and Slovakia. He had been in Hungary to address the Eucharistic Congress there, and on the way back, he was asked a question by America's Vatican correspondent Gerard O'Connell about his views on the debate that's been going on in the United States among the U.S. bishops about whether or not to give pro-choice politicians communion. Joining me today to discuss the Pope's comments is Father Sam Sawyer, a senior editor at America Media. Welcome to Behind the Story, Sam.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Sam, before we get into our conversation, let's take a look at what the Pope said.
Mai ho refutato l'Eucaristia? Nessuno. Non so se è venuto qualcuno che era in queste condizioni, ma io mai ho refutato l'Eucaristia. No? Per questo da prete, mai. E cosa deve fare il pastore? Essere pastore. Essere pastore e non andare condannando, non condannando, sì. Essere pastore. Ma è anche pastore dell'escomunicato, sì. È pastore e deve essere pastore con lui, essere pastore con lo stile di Dio. E lo stile di Dio è vicinanza, compassione e tenerezza.
So Sam, that was just a clip of the Pope's comments. Let's walk through quickly what all he said in response to Jerry's question. So first, he said that he has never himself denied communion to anyone. He actually told kind of a funny story where he said he had been at an old folks' home distributing communion, and one woman received communion and then told him afterwards, "Thank you, I'm Jewish." And he said, "Well, the one that I gave you was Jewish." Well, so, Pope Francis is acknowledging that he makes mistakes too. What were you going to say?
I was going to say that Pope Francis also pointed out that he said he didn't know if he had ever been in a situation giving communion to a politician who held such a view. And I would say this is also part of the complexity of this situation. I mean, it's one thing, everybody knows who President Biden is, but very often, and I can say this, as a priest who presides at Mass, and you've got people coming up at the communion line, it's not like everyone comes with a detailed placard that says who they are and what political positions they hold, et cetera. So very often, and I think this is one of the things Pope Francis is sort of highlighting here, the actual concrete situation doesn't make it as easy to tell what you should do when. It gets a little more focused, perhaps, when we're talking about well-known politicians, which is, of course, where the debate among the U.S. bishops has been.
Right, that's right. And after that, the Pope went into reiterating his opposition to abortion. Obviously, he restated some of the things that he said before. He likens getting an abortion to hiring a hitman, and then he kind of talked about how no problems are ever solved by ending a human life.
Right. So that's a line we heard from Pope Francis that we've heard frequently from him in the past when he's been talking about the morality of abortion. Another line we heard from Pope Francis that we've heard before was him saying that communion is not a prize for the perfect, which is also a way that he's talked about this question of who's worthy or not to receive communion, reminding us that communion is for sinners, which all of us are.
Right. And then we get into kind of the real answer to the question that was asked, which is what he would advise pastors to do if they're in this situation, what he would advise bishops to do if they were considering this question, which the U.S. bishops are right now. They're in the middle of drafting a document on what they've called Eucharistic coherence. So, Sam, do you want to summarize for us what the Pope said in response to that question specifically?
Sure. And I think it's important to say that the first thing the Pope said was he was not speaking to give instructions on the U.S. situation, which he said he doesn't know the details of. He's the Pope of the whole world, not just the United States, and this is a very particular U.S. church issue. But he did say that he would talk about general principles, and the main principle he focused on was, he said, this is a pastoral question, not a political question, and it needs to be dealt with at the pastoral rather than the political level. And then he spent some time talking about what goes wrong, as he said, when bishops act politically rather than acting pastorally. And that, I think, is really where Pope Francis put the focus, and where, to the degree that you can interpret it this way, the advice he's giving to the U.S. bishops as they consider this is to focus on it as a pastoral issue before, and to be cautious about, to actually be really careful about the fact that it can drag them into politics, which, as he said, is a space that it's not good for the church to be in that way.
Mm-hmm. So, Sam, let's talk about what that means, that it's a pastoral question, not a political one. We know that the Pope has talked a lot of times about not politicizing the sacraments, not using religion just to justify your political end goal. But I want to focus on this pastoral question because, I think that there are some people who see that that there is a defined Catholic doctrine on worthiness to receive communion. There are different debates around maybe to what degree a pro-choice politician is in sin. I'm not an expert on any of this, but I want to ask you about what it means to put this in the realm of the pastoral, because I think that some see kind of the freedom for a pastor to decide whether to give communion to someone as maybe being in tension with the kind of doctrinal line that's already been laid out. Can you talk to me a little about that?
Sure. I think it's also important to say here, and when I wrote about this, looking at it after the U.S. bishops had their meeting where the proposal to draft this document came up, one of the things I pointed out there is there is zero doctrinal disagreement, either about the moral doctrine on abortion, or about the doctrine regarding worthiness to receive communion, right? All the bishops agree on both those things. Pope Francis is also on the same page with both those things, and the church is clear about that doctrine. So this is not a question of people debating what the specific doctrine on the morality of abortion or on worthiness to receive communion is. It's a question of application. It's a question of how those truths get played out in the concrete life of the church in this situation of politicians who are known to be pro-choice presenting themselves to receive communion. And in saying that this is a pastoral question, I think the main thing Pope Francis is saying is this is a very concrete question that is not going to have a whole bunch of universal answers and is actually really hard to answer universally, right? It is hard to answer this with a policy, and Pope Francis seems to be saying instead, the issue here is for individual bishops acting as pastors of their local dioceses and also individual pastors, actual pastors in parishes dealing with people most directly, acting to make these decisions. And there, what he said, and I'm going to read from the transcript here, he said, "What must the pastor do? Be a pastor, don't go condemning. Be a pastor because he is a pastor also for the excommunicated." He had talked about this is the Pope Francis's expression of the reality of the doctrine on worthiness to receive, right? If you have separated yourself from the truth that the church teaches, it's possible that you've put yourself out of communion. But Francis says, be a pastor because he is a pastor also for the excommunicated, pastors with God's style, which is closeness, compassion, and tenderness. And that triad, closeness, compassion, and tenderness, is something we hear about a lot from Francis. It also reflects his focus on identifying God's mercy as one of the primary attributes of God and one of the ways that the church needs to communicate about God. And I will say one of the things that I saw in this transcript that was helpful for me as someone who has thought about this and written about this a few times, I realized that I can often get sort of lulled into thinking that this is mostly a doctrinal argument, right? It's an argument about how we understand the doctrine, what parts of it we prioritize, how we sort of rank relative issues and things like that. But what I found helpful from Pope Francis's focus on the pastoral reality here is he pointed out that the pastoral reality is also a theological reality, right? Like God's adopting God's style, closeness, compassion, and tenderness, that is also a theological truth, because that's the way God deals with us. That's what it means that Jesus comes to us in the incarnation and seeks out sinners, right? So it doesn't, and that's not to be held sort of over and against the doctrinal truth about the fact that abortion is immoral and destroys human life, nor is that to be held over and against the truth that there is a question of worthiness to receive communion and whether or not we really are in communion with the church when we come forward for the sacrament. But alongside those truths is also the truth that God accompanies us in closeness, compassion, and tenderness. And I think really what Francis is calling for is to say, figuring out how to put those three things together and which ones to emphasize at which times, these are eminently pastoral, concrete questions that have to be answered in concrete circumstances.
Right. Pope Francis really believes that you need to look at the person in front of you and the situation in front of you, and that's kind of the pastoral responsibility here. And this was something that was echoed by Cardinal Ladaria, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, when he sent a letter to the U.S. bishops while they were kind of having this debate. And he said, what you need to do is kind of hold your horses on drafting a document. What you need to do is dialogue with each other about this issue and dialogue with the people who are involved. So he actually said, dialogue with the politicians who are in question here. And that's the kind of case-by-case dealing with the individual that the Pope really sees as being necessary work as a pastor.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly one of the things that Cardinal Ladaria's letter to the U.S. bishops pointed at. But I think one of the things that this also highlights is it is challenging to find spaces for that kind of dialogue once the issue has become political in the way that Pope Francis describes it, especially once it's become partisan, right? Once it's seen as a contest that ends up supporting one specific political viewpoint or party over another. And that, I think, is one of the real challenges, that the kind of dialogue Pope Francis is encouraging and calling the church to, the kind of dialogue I think that Cardinal Ladario is pointing to as a way forward for the bishops figuring out how to be pastors on this question, that kind of dialogue doesn't happen, in press conferences and back and forth quotes to reporters like us as we're asking, what does this all mean? Or as, our Vatican correspondent is asking Pope Francis, what should we do about this? That's not the venue where this level of dialogue can happen. It needs to happen concretely and personally and pastorally, right? That's what the word, one of the things the word pastoral means in this context.
Right. So Pope Francis ends up not settling this question, but he doesn't settle this question because he does want it in the hands of the individual pastors. And that kind of brings us back to the question of the U.S. bishops and the fact that they're drafting this document right now. I wonder what effect you think that the Pope's comments might have on the U.S. bishops' process of drafting a document.
So, tough to read the crystal ball there, I think.
For sure.
And we haven't seen a draft, the draft that the bishops will be ultimately discussing in their November meeting, nor have we heard much about it recently. What we have heard a couple months ago, the last time this was big in the news, is that they are not planning for that document to announce any national policy or, discuss any specific politicians or discuss, or even, although this is a little bit more unclear, to focus on politicians as a class. It's apparently going to be a broader document about Eucharistic coherence and worthiness to receive the sacrament as one part of that document. So it could be that, what we have is sort of a much more general document on the Eucharist and the life of the Church that in a lot of ways will be not as big news, at least relative to this question of President Biden receiving communion or not. But I think around that, around this whole question, there's whatever happens with the document. And I think one of the challenges that the U.S. bishops face is while the discussion and votes of these documents get quite a lot of discussion sometimes, there aren't actually, the actual reading of these documents is not as much a reality in the life of the church, unfortunately. when it comes to the question of how will Pope Francis's comments influence the bishops, I think the answer is subtly, if at all, right? I think Pope Francis is certainly continuing to telegraph that he expects the bishops to deal with this concretely and that he's suspicious of universal solutions or policies to address a question that's so fundamentally pastoral. But in a lot of ways, I think the bishops have already integrated some of that, and so it might not have an overt impact on the way they deal with the document come November. But I think there's another bigger question here, and it's a question about sort of the relationship between what it means to be pastoral and what it means to be doctrinally orthodox at the same time. And I think Pope Francis got at this. He referred at the very end of his comment, he sort of drew an analogy between this controversy and the controversy we saw over one part of Amoris Laetitia on pastoral accompaniment of people who are in irregular marital situations. And one of the things he said about that, he said that there were a lot of people ready to call heresy about that, instead of seeing it as a form of pastoral accompaniment. And I've realized that is, again, because there's not disagreement over the doctrinal truth here. Everybody agrees on the moral doctrine around abortion. Everybody agrees on the doctrine about worthiness to receive communion. And the disagreement is over questions of pastoral application. That one of the things that's going on here is even though we often process it as an argument about doctrine, it's really, I think, an argument about trust. Do we trust specific pastors or groups of pastors, groups of bishops, to actually make good pastoral decisions about this, or are we constantly second-guessing those pastoral decisions? And if we're going to be second-guessing those pastoral decisions, then the November discussion about the document draft, or all the discussions we've seen leading up to this question of the document on Eucharistic coherence, sort of become like an argument by proxy over who we trust to make which pastoral decisions.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I mean, this was something that came up in the discussions around the document the news coverage around the document that was being drafted was that there was actually a conversation about whether the U.S. Bishops' Conference can issue a document at all that tells pastors what decisions to make in a pastoral situation, like in this situation, which would be up to the discretion of the pastor. And my understanding was that no, they couldn't. I don't know if that was your read on it as well.
Well, certainly it seems to be the case, and Cardinal Lodaria's letter to the U.S. Bishops' Conference pointed this out as well, that any policy level decision, which they've said they're not even trying for anymore, would require both significant consensus, like supermajority among the U.S. bishops, and then approval by the Vatican, both of which seem very unlikely in this case. So individual bishops are going to continue to make decisions in their own dioceses, and Cardinal Gregory, the Archbishop of Washington, in whose diocese most of the question of President Biden receiving communion happens, has said he doesn't expect to start issuing rulings about that in a public, policy level way. That he's dealing with that privately and individually. So I don't think we're likely to see that resolved in this. Resolved in some, now it's all settled and it's over way. But I think, I don't know, my own perspective is that we'd be having a more productive discussion of this in the life of the U.S. Church if we were more realistically talking about, this is about, I want this bishop to do something different, or I want this set of bishops to do something different, rather than treating it as if this is a question about what is doctrinally true about the Eucharist, what is morally true about abortion. Because those questions are actually a place where, in general, the U.S. Church is, or at least the hierarchy of the U.S. Church, is on the same page. Where they're not on the same page is about how to put those into concrete pastoral circumstances. And
whether they trust one another to make the right pastoral decisions.
Well, and this is also, a problem for dialogue, or the other word for this, which is looming large in the life of the church right now, synodality, right? How bishops talk to each other about these complicated, messy circumstances, how they hear the voices of the rest of the faithful in these discussions, and how we work through a process that, as Pope Francis has said many times, will often be messy, and trust that the Holy Spirit is at work in that. But that's another thing Pope Francis said in his answer, that in this discernment of pastoral realities, we need to trust that the Holy Spirit is working.
That's right. And I mean, if we look at the way that God works, to return to the theological reality, right, we know that God chose to enter into human messiness, and that's the message of salvation for us, right? It's that God chooses this, God sanctified this messiness. So, that's a message of hope for us, to kind of embrace the messiness and take it on, which is what Pope Francis is also encouraging the bishops to do.
Right, because God is there in closeness, compassion, and tenderness, working from within.
Sam, thank you so much for joining us here on Behind the Story.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks, Colleen.
And to our viewers at home, thank you for watching Behind the Story with America Media. Before you go, please hit that red subscribe button below. And if you want to read more conversations like this, or hear them, or watch them, you can find all of that by purchasing a digital subscription to America Magazine. You can do that at americamagazine.org/subscribe. Thanks.